Hi there. Well, now let's talk about repeaters. One of the things you'll really get to do with a technician class amateur radio operator that's a lot of fun is work on a lot of repeaters. There's lots of different things you can do with your technician class license. You can work on 6 meters, you can do different modes. You can do single sideband, you can do FM, you can work satellites, you can work space stations, but one of the really practical fun things that you'll probably find yourself doing the most is working repeaters. So let's talk a little bit about what a repeater is, how it works, and some of the questions that apply to it. One of the things that makes a repeater different than what we would call maybe regular radio operation is that it's not simplex. A repeater does not operate simplex. When you have two little walkie-talkie radios and you talk back and forth, that's simplex radio. That means simplex operation. That means you're using the same frequency to talk back and forth to each other. So when you're transmitting on this side and your friends over here are listening on this side, if he transmits, he can't hear you anymore because he's on the same frequency. And you're not going to hear each other because you're trying to transmit on the same frequency. That's simplex operation. And you can do simplex with amateur radio. There are certain frequencies that are reserved for simplex, and a lot of what you would do on HF is a type of simplex where you're going from one station directly to the next station on the exact same frequency. And that would be simplex operation. But on a repeater, what you're doing is you're using two different frequencies. And there's a question that asks, what is meant by the terms input and output frequency when referring to repeater operations? And so let's look a little bit at that. Now, I'm going to mention a few things here briefly, so stay with me, and we're going to see them in practical terms how they work. There's an input and an output frequency on a repeater. That means there's two different frequencies working so that you can hear and transmit. A different frequency for transmit and a different frequency for listening. Now, another thing you're going to find on repeaters, and I'm just going to go through this list and then you'll see we'll put it into practice, is a lot of times station identification, so to speak. That doesn't mean you as a station, but the repeater's identification. I should have said that instead. Repeater identification. Repeater identification, there's a question that asks, why might it be good to know Morse code or CW? And the answer is because then you can interpret a repeater's identification. And you're going to hear when we key up to this repeater, because it's been silent for a little while, that it's going to come back with its identification, but it's going to be in Morse code. So if you knew Morse code, you'd be able to know exactly what the call sign of that repeater is through its identification in Morse code or CW. Now the other thing we're going to listen for, and you'll hear this probably the second time I transmit, is what's called a courtesy tone. And a courtesy tone is simply a tone that lets you know that you made it into the repeater, that the repeater picked you up and retransmitted you. So a repeater takes your signal on one frequency and retransmits it on another frequency at a much higher power level, and usually the antenna is several hundred feet in the air, and so you get a lot better coverage. So if I'm sitting here and a buddy of mine is sitting maybe 40 miles away, and there's no way I can talk to him directly with my 5-watt handy-talkie. However, he might be in a mobile rig and he's able to do 50 watts, but so maybe I'd be able to hear him, but doubtful because his antenna's not that great, it's low. But if I go into the repeater with my 5-watt handy-talkie, then the repeater will retransmit my signal at a very high power level with a big antenna that's very high up and a good antenna, and now he can hear me and he can go back into the repeater and I can hear him. And the repeater's in between the two of us, and so we're able to communicate where we wouldn't be able to by simplex, but we have to use, there's a different input and an output frequency. That also includes offset, so we're going to have the offset is what the difference is between the transmit and the receive frequency. That's the offset, the difference there. And we're going to see that here in a minute. On 2 meters, the most typical offset is 600 kilohertz or 0.6 megahertz. It's the same thing. 0.6 megahertz is the same thing as 600 kilohertz. So you're going to see that here in a moment. Now, the one last thing I want to mention before we transmit here is the CTCSS tone. You'll see that thrown around in your questions quite a bit and in the book. And what a CTCSS tone is a subaudible tone. It's a tone that you can't hear. It's a tone that your radio transmits right at the beginning of your transmission that opens the repeater, if you will. a lot of repeaters have these CTCSS tones on them to prevent interference from other repeaters that might be on the same frequency a little farther away. Because while you might not be able to get into that repeater that's 100 miles away, if they're both very strong repeaters, they could easily interfere with each other. So one will have a CTCSS tone of, say, 103.5 hertz, and the other one will have a CTCSS tone of, let's say, 100 hertz. And there are a lot of different tones that could be used. All those tones, as you can tell from hertz, about 100 hertz, somewhere in there, are subaudible. You can't hear them. Now, I'm going to go into a repeater here. I have a subaudible tone set, even though this repeater doesn't require it. You won't hear that tone because it's subaudible, and it happens right at the beginning of my transmission. I'm going to key up, and of course I have to always identify myself, so I'll give my call sign here, and then you will hear the identification of the repeater. Now, you'll look here and you'll see we're on 145.13 megahertz, 145.13 megahertz. That's the frequency I'm on. That's what I'm listening on. And the repeater transmits on 145.13, which means I listen on that frequency. But you'll see I transmit on a different frequency, and that's the one that the repeater listens on. So the repeater and I are listening on different frequency and transmitting on different frequencies so we can hear each other. All right, here we go. Pay close attention and see what happens to the frequency here when I transmit. KJ4FCZ testing. There, did you hear the identification? And did you see that we went down to 144.53 megahertz? That is 600 kilohertz lower than 145.13. Take 145.13 megahertz, subtract 0.6 megahertz from it, and you get 144.53 megahertz. Now listen for the courtesy tone. KJ4FCZ clear. There's the courtesy tone. That's what you're going to hear a lot of times when you key up to a repeater. That lets you know that you got into the repeater. Now, if I didn't have the right subaudible tone, the CTCSS tone, and I tried to go into that repeater, then you wouldn't hear the courtesy tone. It wouldn't come back to you because you're transmitting without the subaudible tone. The repeater doesn't open up. It doesn't give you a CTCSS tone back. Now here's a couple of other questions we want to look at. Why should you pause briefly between transmissions when using a repeater? To listen for anyone to break in. Remember, amateur radio, we want to listen and be alert for other people that might be trying to come into the radio and that might want to use those frequencies. And we don't want to tie up the repeater so nobody else can use it. So take a break there, and listen. Well, I hope that helps you a little bit with the CTCSS tones and with the courtesy tones and understanding how a repeater works and the difference between repeater operation and simplex operation. And, I'm sure there'll be a few questions, but just keep looking at the material and you'll get it. We'll be back with more later.